be refuting the claim that CO2 emissions are affecting the atmosphere. To begin, I have an issue with the major claim of this argument, in that it's hardly an argument at all. CO2 is part of the atmosphere. It's what makes it up. And so saying that CO2 affects the atmosphere is kind of not an argument at all. To clarify, it would have to be it significantly affects the atmosphere or it's harming the atmosphere. Just saying that it affects it is not really an issue. There is part of it having it affects it. There's the other problem that during the speech, his evidence seems to point to a different claim than what is written on his outline. It seems to point more towards global warming as an issue rather than deterioration of the ozone. So I will be sticking mainly to his outline, but also there are a few inferential leaps that have to be made to tie into his speech. He makes two secondary claims, the first being that increased CO2 emissions are deteriorating the atmosphere. Now, firstly, this is factually incorrect. CO2 is part of the atmosphere. Additional CO2 actually thickens the atmosphere. That's part of what causes the greenhouse effect, which he talked about during his own speech. In fact, during his speech, he himself said that it thickened the atmosphere, which kind of brings about a self-contradiction from his own outline. He also goes on in his outline to say that car CO2 emissions are 19.4 pounds per gallon of gas, but he doesn't give any perspective to that information. How much does that mean? Is that a big number? Is that a small number? So I looked it up, and it turns out that only 14% of all carbon emissions are caused by transportation in general, not just cars, which means that while it was obviously, he was in the speech at least, he was making the point that cars were a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Looking it up, it's only a small portion of the actual emitted amount. Then his secondary claim, atmosphere structures weakening, is really just a repetition of the first claim with a slight change in wording. Deterioration of the atmosphere, atmosphere structures weakening, they're functionally similar, except the first one gives a reason for it. So already that's been disproven. But then his two smaller facts, which he includes in his outline, are that climate changes are arising due to the weakening of the atmosphere, which is once again sort of a repetition of weakening of the atmosphere, which has been proven to be incorrect, and that solar radiation in major cities is higher than in a lesser populated city. So I looked into that, and apparently there was some confusion in the entire argument with this whole deterioration of the atmosphere thing. Global warming actually causes thickening of the atmosphere, as he himself said. What causes deterioration of the atmosphere is fluorocarbon emissions, which is an issue that was back in the 70s, and it actually offsets the effect of global warming. In addition, when he says solar radiation, he doesn't take any pains to define solar radiation. Solar radiation can mean many things. The sun emits various kinds of radiation. Sunlight itself is radiation. So I bring up the fluorocarbon point because in his speech it was inferred that this was harmful radiation, and looking at what kinds of harmful radiation could be emitted by the sun and what weakening the atmosphere could let which kinds of harmful radiation in, led me to the discovery that in fact his argument was made on a different issue than global warming in that point. That is essentially it. I'm sorry if there's a little bit of structural confusion in my argument, but as I said before, I had to piece together the gist of the argument based on a combination of his speech and the outline, which were somewhat differing from their points. Thank you.
All right, Robert. The main issue that I see going on here is that we get more of an analysis than a refutation. And part of the reason that that's occurring is because you think that the advocate has confused a couple of arguments and you need to clarify that, which is okay. However, let's assume for a second that the arguments are really two separate issues. You could probably still have a response to the first and the second points, with even though they do deal with separate kinds of issues, by challenging some of the premises on those points. Now, the main issue on the first point seems to be just this whole idea, there's a lot of wordplay on it about whether or not CO2 is deteriorating or thickening the atmosphere, and CO2 being part of the atmosphere. I think the underlying inference of the advocate is that the CO2 is being added to the atmosphere, which is going to make it more problematic for us. That's the global warming argument that you're talking about. And there are plenty of challenges to our ability to understand the nature of global warming or make inferences on the basis of the presence of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I think that you would probably be better off making some direct contradictory claims on that point. When you get to the issue of the second point with the radiation, I think you again are kind of playing some games with the radiation, what kind of radiation, is it good or bad, so on and so forth. And then you do clarify that there's really an issue about chlorofluorocarbons that create this problem. At one point you say this actually offsets the impact of global warming, but you don't give us any evidence on that. That's completely your assertion. I just didn't see much evidence being developed to support either the first or the second points. Like I said, a lot of analysis and a lot of emphasis on language and definitional questions, which are good questions to ask, but basically that's the kind of response that you could give 5 minutes after the advocate spoke instead of one that's several days afterwards. And I would think that you could develop a little bit more cogent and definitive argument on this. I understand that because you thought that he conflated the two things, that you are trying to clarify it, but the clarification of his argument is perhaps less important than the clarity of your response to it. All right, thank you.